Good morning, everyone. I appreciate everybody that came, and I appreciate everybody that's online. Today, I'm going to talk about the nature of suffering. Usually, when we talk about suffering in Buddhism, we talk about how to alleviate suffering. The Buddha said that what he taught was suffering and the alleviation of suffering, right? And so the focus tends to be why we suffer. But deep insight into the nature of suffering itself is extremely important for a full understanding. The Four Noble Truths, which were the first sermon that the Buddha taught, explores the cause and how to escape or minimize suffering. But I think sometimes we rush to that point. We can be in a hurry to avoid suffering, to get away from it, to push it away, to close our eyes to it, and dwell on ideas of liberation, enlightenment, or Buddha nature. We like to wax poetic about how Buddha nature includes both delusion and enlightenment, but there's a natural tendency to want to spend more time thinking about enlightenment, assuming that we know suffering, feeling that we don't have to investigate it, that we can put suffering into a box that's often labeled do not touch. But in many ways, the investigation of suffering is the heart of our practice. It is the seed the practice springs from, the mud that the lotus sprouts from. And although we don't often think of it this way, most everything we can say about enlightenment, we can say about suffering as well. The first thing I want to talk about in regards to the nature of suffering is that suffering is bigger than us. It's bigger than you or me or any individual person. The first noble truth is not you will have suffering. The Buddha did not say you will have suffering. He said that life is or contains dukkha, which is suffering, unsatisfactoriness, friction. That's a subtle but very important distinction. It's not that you will have, it's that there is. This is the samsara world. Dukkha is an aspect of the functioning of this universe, but we have a tendency to take suffering personally. This is my suffering. We can, and we often do, use this pain to reify the self. We draw boundaries of self or a story around this pain. I know that I've had periods in my life where I've defined myself by my pain, my anger, my fear. But just as we say that enlightenment is not a thing outside of ourselves that we go and get, this is true of suffering as well. If enlightenment is an active embodiment of the functioning of the world, so is suffering. Suffering exists. We experience this suffering's particularity, but this pain is not a thing that we have. It makes no more sense to say our pain, my pain, than it does to say our enlightenment, my enlightenment. We experience this pain, but it is not ours. Yet we try to claim it, draw boundaries around it, and hang our story onto it. And yet suffering itself is bigger than us. It cannot be contained within this form. Like the suffering of allergies. Sometimes we feel this acutely, this sense that suffering is bigger than us in this form. We go through such a painful time that we say to ourselves, this is too big for me. I cannot handle this. I cannot encompass this. Our response should not be too bad, toughen up. Nor should it be to try and deny or bypass our pain. That's another common thing that we try to do. Instead, we become intimate with this suffering and understand it as something that is bigger than this form. There's a story in early Buddhism that's one of my favorites. The Buddha is wandering around India giving his teachings, and he stops in a small town, and a mother comes to him and says, "My child has died." I think in many ways, this is the most awful suffering a human can experience in this world. My child has died. And this woman comes to Buddha and says, "I hear you are an enlightened being with great powers. bring my child back. The Buddha's response is to ask the mother to go and find a mustard seed from a house that is not known death. And he will make special medicine and talk about bringing the child back. So this woman, her name is Kisa Gotami, went to every house in town, asking for a mustard seed, and if anyone in that house had ever died, right? Because that's the key. You must go to a house that is not known death. And especially in this time, ancient India, where multi-generation households are the norm, and people pretty much always died at home. That's an impossible task. Every household had known death. Kisa Gotami eventually realized that every household knew death and loss. Everyone knew suffering and grief. So she gained understanding and eventually returned to the Buddha and became a disciple. It's a very famous story. My understanding is not that the Buddha was saying to Kisa Gotami, go get some perspective. Everybody suffers. You're not special. Instead, my understanding is that Kisa Gotami discovered that every household and every being knew death and loss. And that as her heart broke, the heart of the world broke with her. When you meet people in grief and loss, you realize something very profound. These people knew Kisa Gotami's grief, and they met her with compassion. And Kisa Gotami grew to know their grief. The grief of those in the world around her, that it was a universal thing. Just as we say that we wake up with all beings. When we examine suffering in this way, we can see that our heart breaks with all beings as well. I was thinking about my friend Tara's funeral last year, sitting with her husband who had just lost his wife in her 40s. It was very unexpected. And all I could do was sit there with him while his heart broke. And my heart broke with him. And that's all I could do, was break with him. Or when my students go through hard times and my heart aches to see them in pain. If the universe is waking up with us as we wake up, the heart of the universe must also break when our hearts break. No separation means no separation. Not for the good stuff and not for the bad stuff. We don't get to choose. When I think about the heart of the universe breaking with us, I think of Kannon Bodhisattva. This is Avalokiteshvara in India. And then when that moved into China, it became Guanyin. And in Japan, it's pronounced Kannon. So this is the Bodhisattva of compassion, the personification of compassion. We could just say compassion. It is said that Kannon hears the cries of the world. Many descriptions of Kannon is that she has 1,000 eyes and 1,000 arms to see all the suffering of the world and respond. But stop and really think what that would mean, to be a personification of compassion, to truly feel the suffering of the world, because this is compassion, passion with, feeling with. This is not a cold, remote idea, untouched and unaffected. This is the opposite of that. I know I like to talk about this a lot, but we often talk about that mountain metaphor, right? We talk about the mountain being very stable, no matter what comes. But this is not staying untouched or unaffected. When the sun shines, the mountain is hot. When the snow falls, the mountain is cold. The weather makes the mountain. There's an intimate connection. We say Kannon hears the cries of the world, but really, Kannon is the cries of the world. Kannon is the cry and the response. And we are all Kannon Bodhisattva. When we are in pain, our cries are the cries of the world. And so is our compassion. This is feeling the suffering of the world and responding. Think about what it feels like when your heart breaks with another. I think we've all experienced that. Now multiply that times 8 billion people and every plant and every animal in all the world. What a big heart that would take. What stability that would take. Only the whole world, the whole universe could have this heart. Kannon Bodhisattva is the whole world, and so are you. It can't be otherwise. So What do we do when we have this too big feeling, this I cannot handle this feeling, this too much feeling? We take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. When we take refuge in Buddha, yes, we're taking refuge in the historical Buddha and what he taught. But we're also taking refuge in our own enlightened nature, which maybe in times of great distress can be hard to feel. But we take refuge in this enlightened nature that is that is an expression of all things. And we take refuge in Kannon Bodhisattva, who is our compassionate nature, who sees the cries of the world and responds. We are all Buddha, and we are all Kannon Bodhisattva. So when the suffering is too big for us, for this form, we take refuge in Buddha and Kannon as our enlightened nature, as our compassionate nature, which is the whole world. We take refuge in Dharma, which is the teachings of Buddhism, but also the phenomena of the world. If you hang out at Ocean Gate for a while, you'll hear many of us talk about the big D and the little d, right? Big D Dharma for teachings, little d Dharma for phenomena, all the things. We take refuge in this world, which is the world of realization and illusion, suffering and nirvana. We take refuge in this world, or as Dogen says, we get up from the ground by using the ground. And we take refuge in Sangha, which is community, our community. The friends and family, but also the Sangha of the whole world, which is not separate from us. So we can think of this as I take refuge in the teacher, the teachings, and my group. And this is true and wholesome and very helpful. But we can also understand this as taking refuge in our own compassionate and enlightened nature, and the phenomena and the community that is all of reality. We take refuge in Buddha nature, which is the functioning of the world. And really, what else could we take refuge in but the functioning of the world? Part of this refuge seems to be dropping the story that we attach to our suffering. Sometimes this is called rumination, when we think over and over again, right? About the causes and the stories we create about our suffering, rather than just sitting with the pure experience of the feeling itself. I think we do this because our brain is trying to save us from pain. It's very human. If we analyze, or better yet, control the story, we think we can minimize the pain or escape the pain. In uncontrollable circumstances, we can gain an illusion of control through this obsessive thinking, or in this day and age, through obsessive checking the news media over and over and over again. I remember when we got evacuated because of the forest fires, and there was that fire tracking map. You know, I probably checked it about 50 times more than I really needed to during the day because I wanted to. And somehow I remember thinking back, like somehow that gave me a little sliver of a illusion of control, right? The more I checked, it felt like the only thing I could do. But this is an illusion. Our deepest self, our Buddha nature, is wiser than this. When we really pay attention, we can see that the divisions we create around our suffering, our illusions of control, are not ultimately there. And all that remains is to be here now and experience what is arising. How does this suffering arise from us? Is it hot? Is it cold? What's the texture of it? Where do we experience it in our body? Where do we experience it in our heart? This can be very hard, and so it's okay to take breaks. Sometimes we do this for 2 minutes or 30 seconds, and then we go for a walk, or we pet our dog, or we wash the dishes, or we do something else, and that's okay. So we understand this, that suffering exists, and we experience it in a certain way, in a certain time and place. Because universality does not negate particularity, right? We say that in terms of like being, we say this in terms of enlightenment, and this is a very important understanding about suffering. This is not the spiritual bypass of, oh, it's all the world suffering, so you know, I'm fine. Like that's not what we're talking about. We experience this. One thing I've talked to Jaku about is, okay, in this case, how do I avoid hating suffering? No one wants to suffer. Suffering is not fun. It's not enjoyable. And I think the aversion to suffering is what brought many people, including me, to practice, right? Suffering sucks. I would like to not suffer anymore. But suffering is an aspect of the functioning of this world. How do we live in this Saha world and not hate it? This is really challenging. But when we apply hate to suffering, all we do is compound our own pain. But instead of this, we understand that suffering is a part of this human experience in this human world. In my experience, when I stopped identifying this as my pain and experience this as the suffering of the world, we can take it a little bit less personally. It's pain. That's all it is. Here and now, there is pain. And we don't have to add anything to that. We don't have to add a story. We don't have to add ownership. We just deal with what is arising here and now. This helps us not add hatred to suffering. Understood this way, hating suffering makes no more sense than hating an ocean or a storm. It's just pain. And that's what's arising right now. Gradually, as we sit with intimacy, we are able to allow the weather to create the mountain. Because we are changed by this level of grief or suffering. When I was up in Oregon, I was talking to Ejo about this. Initially, I think for a lot of times, especially grief, great pain, it feels like there's a weight on top of you and you're being crushed by it. And slowly, somehow, in ways I don't think we always understand, it's like that pain and that suffering, and we become kind of granular and it settles into us. And every cell in our body is reoriented in this new way. It's kind of like when you see those like quick ice crystals form in the water. It feels like this pain, this suffering, this dukkha, which felt like this crushing weight, reorients us and enters every cell. And we have a new self, a new understanding of the self, a new understanding of life. And just like enlightenment, when we had this experience, we integrate it. We chant birth and death shoji every week during service. One line in particular speaks to me about this. Just set aside your body and mind, forget about them, and throw them into the house of the Buddha. And then all is done by Buddha. The functioning of reality, just as it is the house of Buddha. It's nothing more than this world. The functioning of reality, this world is the house of the Buddha, and so is Buddha. When we stop fixating on our story, when we set aside our body and mind, then all is done by Buddha. We are Buddha, the world is Buddha, and we allow this infinite heart of awakening to hold this suffering when it is too big for this limited form. I think that slowly we integrate this understanding. It's not easy, but we are changed by this when we experience it. We begin to see and feel what it means to throw this life into the house of Buddha and to be Buddha, to be Kannon Bodhisattva. And slowly, sometimes painfully, we realize that to have our heart break with all beings and to wake up with all beings is not actually different at all. Thank you.